My name is Rachel Doyle. I'm 41 years old and I work as a senior billing coordinator at a regional hospital, which is a polite way of saying I spend my professional life untangling other people's financial disasters for a living. I never expected to spend my personal life untangling my own. It was a Tuesday in March when my sister-in-law called me, not my husband, to tell me that Diane, my mother-in-law, 68 years old and the undisputed center of gravity in the Doyle family, had been sitting alone in a hospital waiting room for 4 hours because nobody else could be bothered to leave work. Diane needed a procedure. Diane needed someone to fill out the intake forms, someone to argue with the billing office about a pre-authorization code, someone to sit in a beige plastic chair and hold her purse while they wheeled her back through double doors marked staff only. Out of 4 adult children, 3 grandchildren-in-law, and 1 daughter-in-law, Diane had spent 11 years describing to her friends as not really family, more like an in-law situation. I was the one they called. I want to be honest about something before I go any further because I think it matters more than anything else I'm about to tell you. I said yes. I didn't hesitate. I didn't demand an apology first or use it as leverage or make her wait the way she had made others wait for things that mattered to them for years. I got in my car 40 minutes after that phone call and I drove 22 miles to Mercy General, and I sat with a woman who once told my husband in front of me at our own engagement dinner that he still had time to think it over. That was 11 years earlier. I remembered the exact words, the exact tone, the exact way she had set down her wine glass afterward like she just said something generous. I remember almost everything exactly. That turned out to be the only real advantage I had in this entire story. I should tell you what the room itself looked like, because I remember it in more detail than I remember most rooms I've spent time in. Beige walls, the specific hospital shade that's meant to be calming and mostly just reads as tired. A television bolted high in the corner playing a rerun of a home renovation show with the sound off and subtitles nobody was reading. A coffee machine that only dispensed decaf, which struck me, even in the moment, as a small, absurd cruelty toward everyone sitting in that room needing exactly the opposite. I noticed all of it with the specific, detached attentiveness I bring to my job, cataloging details the way I catalog line items on a claim, because staying observant has always been easier for me than sitting with feeling. I sat in that waiting room from 2:40 in the afternoon until nearly 7:00 that evening. I filled out 4 separate intake forms because Mercy General's system had apparently never been updated to talk to itself. I called the billing office twice, once from the hallway outside radiology, because I recognized the pre-authorization code they'd flagged as a system error I'd seen 100 times at my own job, and I knew exactly which department to escalate it to. I held Diane's purse, a stiff brown leather thing she'd carried since I'd known her, while a nurse wheeled her back for the procedure. And I remember the particular weight of it in my lap and the particular quiet of that hallway and thinking with a strange, flat clarity, nobody else in this family would know how to do what I'm doing right now. Not because they're incapable, because they've never had to learn. I want to take you back to how we got to that waiting room, because the ending of this story only makes sense once you understand the shape of everything that came before it. This isn't really a story about a single hospital visit. It's a story about what happens when a family finds out, all at once and after 9 years of not looking closely, that the person they had quietly filed under useful but not really family was the only one who had been paying attention the entire time, the only one who had kept the receipts, both literal and otherwise. By the end of that year, Diane Doyle would need me more than she had ever needed her own children, more than she would have ever admitted needing anyone. And I would have a choice to make that none of them saw coming. Not even Diane, especially not Diane. If you've ever been the one who gets the 2 a.m. phone call while everyone else gets the wedding invitation, the one who's family enough to be useful, but never quite family enough to belong, welcome back to the channel and stay with me on this one. This story is for you. If any part of it lands, drop a comment and tell me which moment you recognized first, and subscribe if you'd like more stories like it. #rewind where it started. Let me take you back to 2015, the year I met the Doyles, because you need the origin before you can understand the escalation. I was 30 years old, freshly divorced from a short first marriage that had ended quietly, without villains, working my way up from claims processor to billing coordinator at a hospital in the same mid-sized town where I'd grown up. I met Mark Doyle at a continuing education seminar neither of us particularly wanted to attend. He was an accountant for a mid-sized construction firm, 3 years older than me, quiet in the specific way of a man who had spent his whole life being the reasonable one in a family full of louder people. He proposed the following spring, on a Tuesday over dishes without any grand production, which I liked. I liked that he thought things through carefully before he acted. What I didn't yet understand was that in the Doyle household, thinking things through carefully and waiting to see what mom thinks were functionally the same activity performed by everyone all the time, without anyone quite admitting it out loud. The Doyle family worked like this, and it took me years to see the whole shape of it clearly. Diane sat at the center, not loudly, not through tantrums or ultimatums, but through a kind of quiet gravitational pull that every one of her 4 adult children orbited whether they meant to or not. Her husband, Frank, had died of a heart attack when Mark was 19, and in the more than 20 years since, Diane had built an entire family mythology around herself as the one who had held everyone together after his death. Whether that mythology was entirely accurate was a separate question from whether everyone in the family believed it completely, and everyone believed it completely, including, eventually, me. I should tell you a little about Frank, even though he died 6 years before I ever entered this story, because his absence shaped the family's internal weather more than almost anything else about it. From what Mark and his siblings told me over the years, Frank had been a quiet, steady man, an electrician by trade, the kind of father who showed love through fixing things rather than saying things. When he died suddenly of a heart attack at 51, Diane, then in her mid-40s with a 19-year-old, a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, and an 11-year-old still at home, had genuinely held the household together through sheer force of will, working 2 jobs for the better part of 3 years before her own career stabilized. That part of the family mythology, unlike some others I'd eventually question, was entirely true, and I want to be fair to it. Diane had earned a real claim to being the person who'd held everyone together once when it actually mattered most. The trouble, as I came to understand it much later, was that a true story about one specific chapter of a person's life can calcify into a permanent excuse that gets applied to every chapter afterward, whether or not it still fits. Diane had genuinely sacrificed for her children in 1998 through 2001. That didn't mean every subsequent ask, for the next 20 years, deserved the same unquestioned deference the first ones had rightfully earned. Mark was the second of 4 children. His older sister, Patricia, 44 now, was the golden one, a successful real estate agent with a large house on a cul-de-sac and an even larger personality, the one Diane called first with any good news, the one whose opinions carried unusual weight at family gatherings regardless of the subject. His younger brother, Danny, was the baby of the family at 32 when I met him, perpetually between jobs, perpetually forgiven for it in ways that would have surprised anyone outside the family. And the youngest, Colleen, 29 then, was the wild-card, sharp-tongued, genuinely funny, the one who said out loud the things everyone else at the table was only thinking, which made her simultaneously beloved and a little bit feared. And then there was me, not a Doyle by blood, and it became clear quickly, though not cruelly, not at first, not fully treated as one by marriage either. I remember the specific dinner where I first understood the actual shape of it. It was 6 months before our wedding, an Easter gathering at Diane's house. I had spent 2 hours making a lemon tart from scratch because Mark had once mentioned in passing that his mother liked lemon desserts. I set it on the counter next to Patricia's store-bought pie from the good bakery downtown, and Diane picked up a slice of the pie first, complimented Patricia warmly on always knowing exactly what people like, and never touched the tart, not once, all afternoon. It wasn't malice, exactly. It was more like I simply hadn't yet registered in Diane's internal accounting as a category of person whose effort required acknowledgement. Later that evening, in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, I heard her say to Patricia, not quite quietly enough, "I don't know why he's rushing this. There's no ring on that finger yet that says forever." I stood in the doorway holding a stack of plates and said nothing, and went back out to the table and smiled and helped clear the rest of the dishes. The second memory is sharper, and it's the one I quoted at the very start of this. At our engagement dinner 8 months later, Diane raised a toast, a genuinely warm-sounding one, the kind she was good at, full of nice phrases about family and love, and then, setting her glass down with a small, deliberate click against the table, she turned to Mark and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "You still have time to think it over, you know." No shame in slowing down. Everyone laughed like it was a joke. Mark laughed too, a beat too quickly, in the way people laugh when they're trying to keep something from becoming a real moment. I sat there in a new dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, and I understood with a clarity that has never once left me that I was being evaluated for a role I hadn't technically been offered yet. The third memory is the one that told me exactly where I stood in the family's internal ledger, and it happened about a year into the marriage. I organized Diane's 65th birthday party, found the venue myself after 4 phone calls, coordinated the food with Patricia and Colleen over an increasingly one-sided group text, and paid the $600 deposit out of our own account because nobody else had gotten around to it, and the date was 2 weeks out. At the party itself, Diane stood up with a glass of wine to thank her children for putting together such a beautiful evening. She named all 4 of them, one by one, warmly. She did not name me. Mark squeezed my hand under the table, which I understood even then to be his version of an apology he would never actually say out loud. I smiled and clapped along with everyone else. I want you to notice that I smiled and clapped, because I'm going to do that a lot in the years I'm about to describe, and I want you to understand that smiling and clapping were never the same thing as being okay. That's the pattern that set itself in those first 2 years, and it barely shifted for the next 9. I did the work, and the credit went somewhere else. Hold on to that sentence. It's going to matter a great deal more later. I should also tell you about the small things, because the small things are often what actually train you into a pattern, more than any single dramatic moment ever could. In that first year of marriage, I learned the family's unspoken vocabulary the way you learn a second language by immersion rather than instruction. I learned that, if it's not too much trouble from Diane meant it was already decided, and the only open question was who would end up doing it. I learned that we should really figure out a way to pay you back for that was a sentence that existed purely as a social gesture, never once followed by an actual attempt at repayment. In 9 years, not a single time. I learned that Patricia's compliments were a kind of currency she distributed carefully, and that mine came due only when I was being useful in a way she could take partial credit for. I also want to tell you about the first time I actually tried to say something, because I think it matters that I did try early, before I learned that trying rarely worked the way I hoped. It was Diane's 66th birthday, a year after the party I mentioned, and I said gently over coffee with just the 2 of us, I noticed I wasn't included in the thank yous last year at the party. I know it probably wasn't intentional, but it stuck with me. Diane looked at me for a long moment, and then she said with what sounded like genuine surprise, "Oh, Rachel, you're not one of my children, sweetheart." I didn't think you'd want to be lumped in with that. I remember the exact phrase, lumped in, and I remember smiling and saying something about how it was fine, really no big deal. It wasn't fine. But I didn't yet have the language or the standing to say so plainly, and some part of me still believed that patience was the price you paid to eventually earn belonging. I would spend the next 8 years testing that theory to its absolute limit. # the escalation arc. # year 1, 2016, the first ask. The pattern started small, the way these things almost always do. 6 months after the wedding, Diane's car needed a new transmission, $2,400, a real number, the kind of number that hurts a fixed income. She didn't call Mark and me together to ask for help. She called Mark alone and mentioned it almost in passing, framed as a stressful thing that was simply happening to her, never phrased as a direct request. Mark came to me that night at the kitchen table, still in his work clothes, and said, "I think we should just cover it." She'd never actually ask outright, that's not her way. I remember thinking, even then, in year 1, that's not generosity on her part, that's a technique. Asking sideways means the person actually paying never gets the dignity of being asked directly, and therefore never gets the dignity of saying no directly either. They only get to watch someone else say yes on their behalf, after the fact, as a fait accompli. But I also remember thinking that I was new to this family, and new people don't get to set boundaries in year 1. New people get to prove they're not the problem. So we paid it, in full, within the week. Diane thanked Mark with a long hug in her driveway and told him he was such a good son, always thinking of his mother. She thanked me with a nod and a "you two are sweet." I want to name something here clearly, because it's going to recur again and again over the years I'm about to describe, and if I don't say it plainly now, you might miss it later when it matters most. That's the machinery of it. The request never comes directly to the person actually being asked to pay. It comes sideways, filtered through the person who feels obligated by blood to fix it, so that the person footing the bill never gets the chance to say no in the moment it would actually count, only to watch afterward as someone else says yes for them. Year 2, 2017, the business loan. Danny, 30 that year and freshly fired from his third sales job in 4 years, announced over dinner that he was starting a landscaping business with a friend from high school. Diane called an actual family meeting, a real sit-down at her kitchen table, with printed flyers Danny had made for his imaginary company, laminated even, and framed the whole thing as an investment in your brother's future, the kind Frank would have wanted us to make for each other. The ask was $8,000 total, split evenly between the 4 siblings, meaning $2,000 from Mark's share, which by then meant $2,000 from the joint account I managed for both of us. At that meeting, Diane said the phrase I would hear in a dozen slightly different forms over the following 7 years: family takes care of family. That's just what we do, it's what we've always done. Patricia nodded along solemnly, though I learned much later, almost by accident, through an offhand comment from Colleen, that Patricia had negotiated her own contribution down to $500 by citing a tight month, a claim absolutely nobody verified, because nobody in that family ever verified anything Patricia said about her own finances, even though she was, by every visible measure, the wealthiest of the 4 siblings. Colleen didn't contribute anything at all that year. She said she was still figuring things out in her 20s, which apparently functioned as a permanent exemption, one that somehow never expired even as she moved deeper into her 30s. I remember the exact moment I decided to write the check without further discussion. It was a Sunday evening, and Mark had come home from that kitchen table meeting looking tired in a way I hadn't seen from him before, not angry, not conflicted exactly, just worn down by the sheer social gravity of the room he just sat in. He set his keys on the counter and said, "I know it's a lot to ask this early in things for us. I'll understand if you want to talk about it more before we decide." I remember appreciating, even then, that he offered me the choice explicitly, out loud, which was more than I'd get from most of the sideways asks that followed in later years. I told him I was fine with it. I mostly meant it. Some small part of me, even in year 2, understood that saying yes now was buying goodwill I might need to draw on eventually. Though I couldn't have articulated it that clearly at the time, it was more instinct than strategy, the kind of quiet social math you do without quite noticing you're doing it. I paid the $2,000 without much of a fight. I told myself it was reasonable on its face. Helping a struggling brother-in-law start a legitimate business is, in isolation, a decent thing for a family to do for one of its own. The landscaping business folded 11 months later after a single, unprofitable summer. Nobody in the family ever mentioned the money again, not once, not even in passing. Danny got a new truck financed that following spring, and nobody connected those 2 facts out loud at any family dinner I attended, though I noticed the timing privately, and I wrote it down that same week in a notebook I had just started keeping, not out of suspicion yet, not really, just out of the same habit of documentation that made me good at my actual job. Year 2, continued 2017, the pattern confirms itself. I want to add one more detail to year 2, because it's small but it confirms something I'd only suspected before. A few months after the landscaping loan, I mentioned to Diane, carefully, over the phone, that Mark and I were saving for a down payment on a slightly larger house, and that the $2,000 had actually set that timeline back by nearly 4 months. Diane's response was warm and immediate and entirely unhelpful. "Oh, you two will figure it out, you're both so responsible with money. That's exactly why we don't worry about you the way we worry about Danny." I hung up the phone that day with a strange, hollow feeling I couldn't quite name yet. It would take me years to name it accurately. Being responsible with money hadn't earned me protection from being asked. It had made me a more attractive target for the asking, precisely because everyone trusted I'd absorb it without complaint. Year 3, 2018, Christmas and the first real warmth. I want to pause the escalation here for a moment, because if I only give you the hard parts in sequence, you'll come away with the wrong picture of these 9 years. There was real warmth threaded through them too, and it usually came from one specific person, Mark's daughter from his brief first marriage, Ellie, who was 8 years old that Christmas. Ellie had never once been anything but genuinely glad to see me, from the very first time we met. She didn't understand or care about family hierarchies, toast lists, or who got named and who didn't. That Christmas, she handed me a card she'd made herself out of red construction paper, with Best Rachel written across the front in glitter glue that was still slightly wet. When I asked her, laughing, why Best instead of just my name, she said, with the total seriousness only an 8-year-old can manage. Because you're the only one who reads to me at the right speed. Everyone else reads too fast because they're thinking about something else. Diane, standing nearby refilling a coffee cup, overheard this. She said nothing at the time. But I noticed she watched the two of us for a beat longer than the moment strictly required, and I noticed something that looked almost like discomfort cross her face. The very first sign, though I wouldn't understand it as a sign for years, that Diane's private read of me might not have been quite as settled as her public behavior toward me suggested. That small glitter glue moment carried me through more of the years that followed than any single person in the Doyle family ever fully realized. Year 4, 2019, the insurance gap. Diane's health insurance had a gap she hadn't fully understood when she'd switched Medicare Advantage plans the year before to save $40 a month. A $3,600 gap tied to a specialist visit and a round of follow-up blood work connected to some ongoing fatigue she wasn't naming a cause for yet, not to any of us, and possibly not fully to herself. This time I got looped in directly rather than sideways through Mark because it touched medical billing, and Mark said apologetically, "You're really good at this stuff, could you just call and see what you can sort out?" I did not just sort it out, but fight the claim down through a formal appeals process that took 6 full weeks of phone calls on my lunch breaks, using specific knowledge from my actual job that not one other person in that family possessed. And I got the family's exposure reduced from $3,600 down to $1,500. Diane's response when I finally explained what I'd accomplished over dinner was, "See, this is exactly why we need you around. Not thank you. Around the way you describe a tool kept in a drawer for emergencies, useful precisely because it required no maintenance and asked for nothing in return." I told myself that night that this still counted as progress. Being needed felt, at the time, dangerously close to being valued, close enough that I let myself blur the distinction rather than look at it directly. I didn't yet understand how different those two things actually were, or how long it would take me to learn it. Year 4, continued, 2019, what the appeals process actually taught me. I want to linger a moment longer on the insurance appeal from that year, because it turned out to be more formative than I understood at the time. The appeals process took 6 weeks. And across those 6 weeks, I learned every technical detail of Diane's Medicare Advantage plan far better than she understood it herself. Better, frankly, than her own primary care office's billing staff understood it, which is part of why I was able to get the reduction I did. I remember sitting on hold with the insurance company on a Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break, eating a sandwich one-handed, while a hold music version of a song I couldn't place looped for the 11th time, and thinking almost fondly that this was a strange kind of intimacy, knowing someone's financial vulnerabilities down to the line item, more thoroughly than her own children did, simply because I happened to have the professional vocabulary to go looking. I didn't resent it at the time. I want to be honest about that. I found a real, if complicated, satisfaction in being good at something that helped someone I cared about. What I didn't yet see clearly was how that satisfaction was being quietly harvested. Not maliciously, not by any one deliberate villain, but by a family system that had learned, gradually and almost passively, that my competence could be relied upon indefinitely, without anyone needing to build their own competence or their own vigilance alongside mine. Every problem I solved made the next problem more likely to land in my lap instead of anyone else's, because I had become, functionally, the family's designated capable person, and designated capable people rarely get released from the role once it's assigned, however informally. Year 5, 2020, the roof. This was the year the dollar figures stopped being small, and the year I started, without fully admitting it to myself, keeping closer track. Diane's roof needed full replacement after a spring storm. Insurance covered part of it, but there was an $11,000 gap between the payout and the actual repair estimate, because Diane had quietly let her homeowner's policy lapse into a cheaper coverage tier 2 years earlier to save money, without telling any of her children. Another kitchen table meeting followed. Another version of family takes care of family. This time, Patricia said the specific line that made me start paying much closer attention than I had before. Rachel and Mark are doing well right now, and they don't have kids of their own to save for. She said it warmly, almost like a compliment, the way you'd point out someone's good fortune. It took me a full day afterward to understand what she'd actually said underneath the warmth, that my lack of children made my money more available for other people's needs than theirs was. We covered $6,000 of the $11,000 gap. Patricia covered $2,000. Colleen and Danny covered nothing, citing pandemic-related job instability, which was, to be fair, genuinely true for both of them that particular year. I don't begrudge that part of it even now. What I began to notice, and wrote down carefully that same night in the notebook, was the running total forming in my head. $2,400 plus $2,000 plus roughly half of $3,600 plus $6,000. Just over $15,000 across 5 years. And every single time it had been framed to me as something I was fortunate to be able to do, never once as something anyone owed me acknowledgement for, let alone repayment. Year 5 continued 2020, the conversation I didn't have. There's a conversation from that same year I want to include, because I think about it often, and because it shows the specific shape of the fear that would later define the entire decision chapter of this story. A few weeks after the roof meeting, I sat in my car outside Diane's house for almost 20 minutes before going inside, rehearsing a version of a conversation where I said plainly, I don't think this is fair, and I'd like us to talk about it as a family honestly with real numbers. I never had that conversation. I went inside instead and helped Diane pick out shingle colors and said nothing about the money at all. I remember driving home that night furious at myself, not at Diane, not at Patricia, at myself, for rehearsing honesty in a parked car and then walking inside and performing agreeableness instead. I didn't yet understand that the rehearsal itself was doing important, if invisible, work, that every unfinished, unspoken version of that conversation was quietly building toward the one I'd eventually have to have, 4 years later, with a binder on the table instead of just my voice. Year 6, 2021, the small warmth that mattered most. Mark's brother Danny, of all people, gave me the moment I held on to longest that particular year. He'd taken a steady warehouse management position by then, his first genuinely stable job in years, and at a 4th of July barbecue standing near the cooler, he pulled me aside and said quietly, almost awkwardly, like it cost him something to say it out loud. I know Mom doesn't always say it, and honestly none of us do it enough, but I see what you do for this family. I just wanted you to actually hear that somebody notices. It wasn't a large gesture. It didn't change one single thing about the underlying pattern. But I remembered it the way you remember any genuine kindness in a long stretch of being quietly taken for granted. And it's a significant part of why, years later, Danny became one of the 2 people this story didn't end badly for. Year 6 continued 2021, the vacation. There's one more incident from that year worth including, because it introduced a new variation on the pattern rather than just repeating the old one. Diane announced that autumn that she wanted to take one big family trip to the coast for her 70th birthday the following summer, since who knows how many more of these we'll get. Nobody wanted to be the person who questioned a 70-year-old woman's wish to see the ocean with her family one more time, and I understood that instinct, because I felt it too. The estimated cost for a rental house large enough for everyone came to $6,800 for the week. Diane suggested at dinner that the kids who are doing well right now could cover the difference between what she and Frank's small remaining life insurance payout could contribute and the actual rental cost. Mark and I ended up covering $2,800 of it, more than double what Patricia contributed and nearly triple Danny's share, because Diane said warmly, refilling my wine glass, "You two always make things work somehow. I don't know how you do it." I remember smiling at the compliment and feeling underneath it the same hollow note I'd first noticed back in year 2, when being responsible with money had quietly become a reason to be asked for more of it, not less. The trip itself was, honestly, lovely. Ellie learned to boogie board that week. Diane cried a little on the last night watching the sunset from the porch and said it was the best birthday she could remember having since Frank died. I don't regret paying for it. I want to be clear about that. I regret that paying for it was simply assumed, discussed among everyone else before I was ever consulted, framed as a foregone conclusion rather than a request I got to actually weigh in on. Those are 2 different things, and it took me years to learn how to hold both of them true at once. That a thing can be worth doing and still be asked for unfairly. Year 7 2022, The Wedding Fund. Colleen got engaged that spring. Diane, without ever consulting Colleen's future in-laws about contributing anything at all, simply informed the family that we would be covering the $9,000 difference between what Colleen's own savings could cover and what the venue Diane had personally scouted out and fallen in love with actually cost. Mark and I were asked through Mark for $3,000 of that gap. I remember sitting at our own kitchen table that night, not Diane's table, hours for once, doing the running math out loud for Mark for the first time in 7 years. That's almost $18,000, not counting the parts of the insurance gap I never fully totaled, and not counting all the smaller things. Mark's response was the one I would hear, in slightly different phrasing, every single time I raised it over the years. I know, Rachel, but it's my mom. What am I supposed to do? Just say no to my own mother? I want to be honest about something here because it matters. I didn't push much harder that particular year, and it wasn't because I hadn't noticed the pattern by then. I had, clearly, in writing, in a notebook I could have produced at any moment. It was because underneath the growing irritation was a fear I hadn't yet said out loud to anyone, not even to myself in so many words. If I stopped being the reliable one, the useful one, the one who could always be counted on to solve the problem quietly and without complaint, what exactly was I to this family? I already suspected the answer Diane would have given if I'd asked her plainly, and I wasn't ready yet to hear it confirmed out loud. We paid the $3,000 toward Colleen's wedding. Colleen thanked Mark warmly in her rehearsal dinner toast by name at length. She did not thank me, not by name, not in passing, not at all. I sat at a table near the back of the room with Ellie, 12 years old by then, who leaned over partway through dinner and whispered, without any prompting from me, "You paid for like half of this whole thing, didn't you?" I hadn't told her that. Nobody had told her that. She'd simply noticed the way children sometimes notice the exact things adults have spent years quietly training themselves not to say out loud. Midpoint marker: if any of this is hitting close to home for you, I promise the turn is coming and it's worth staying for. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had your own $18,000 moment. Year 7 continued 2022, the wedding day itself. I want to add one more scene from that year, because it's the moment that, in hindsight, probably should have told me everything I needed to know well before the 11 emails ever existed. At Colleen's actual wedding, several months after we'd paid our $3,000 share, there was a small crisis 2 hours before the ceremony. The florist had shown up with the wrong arrangements entirely, cheaper white carnations instead of the peonies Colleen had specifically ordered and paid a deposit for. Colleen was in tears in the bridal suite. Diane, Patricia, and the wedding planner were talking in circles, unable to reach the florist's emergency line. Someone, I don't even remember who, said, "Get Rachel, she'll know what to do." I wasn't in the wedding party, I wasn't even supposed to be backstage. But I was pulled in anyway, and within 20 minutes I'd found the florist's actual emergency contact through the venue's vendor coordinator, negotiated a partial refund on the spot, and located a local shop that could rush a smaller peony arrangement for the head table within the hour. Paid for, again, out of my own card, $340, reimbursed eventually but not for another 6 weeks. I fixed it. Colleen got her peonies, or close enough, for the head table at least. Nobody thanked me in any toast that night. But what struck me most, walking back to my seat in a beautiful dress I'd bought for the occasion, was Diane's comment as I passed her table. "I don't know what we'd do without you for these things, Rachel, honestly." I smiled and said something modest. Underneath the smile, though, something had shifted almost imperceptibly. I remember thinking very clearly for the first time, these things, not you. Not having you in the family. These things, meaning the fixing, specifically, isolated from me as a person, as though the two were separable, as though what they valued was a service I happened to provide rather than a person who happened to also provide it. Year 8 2023, the first real crack. This was the year I started keeping more than a private notebook. My job had made me fluent in something the Doyles never expected a daughter-in-law to be fluent in: paper trails, and how to read the small print of a family's finances the way I read the small print of an insurance policy. When Diane asked me that spring for help just organizing some of her bills since things had gone a bit confusing since Frank passed, God rest him, I said yes, and I began quietly keeping copies of everything I touched. I told myself at the time that I was simply being thorough, the way I was thorough at work. I was actually, without fully admitting it to myself yet, building a record. That was also the year I overheard the first real crack in the story the family told about itself, and about me. At Thanksgiving in the kitchen, refilling the water pitcher, I heard Patricia say to Diane, not realizing I was standing 2 feet behind her at the sink, "Rachel's fine with it, she's always been fine with it. She doesn't really have anything else going on with the money side of things anyway." I stood very still. I said nothing. I finished refilling the pitcher and carried it back out to the table, and I remember thinking, with a calm that genuinely surprised me at the time, that's not a misunderstanding I overheard. That's a shared, settled assumption. They have discussed this, at some point, among themselves, without me anywhere in the room, and they have collectively agreed that my money is simply more available to them than theirs is to each other. Not because I actually have more of it, provably, but because I don't matter enough in their internal accounting for anyone to feel the need to protect it on my behalf. Year 9, 2024, the year before. By this point in the story, the running total in my notebook, informal at the start, but meticulous and dated by then, sat at just over $23,000 across 9 years, and that figure didn't even include hundreds of smaller, uncounted things. Gas money for driving Diane to appointments, entire evenings spent on hold with her insurance company, a Mother's Day brunch I had personally paid for 3 years running because Rachel's just so good at planning that kind of thing. Mark's income had grown steadily over those 9 years. Mine had grown even more, particularly after my promotion to senior billing coordinator 2 years earlier, which is part of the quiet, unspoken reason the requests had gradually, steadily migrated toward me specifically over time, even though they were always still technically addressed to the family as an abstract, undifferentiated whole. It was also the year Ellie, 14 by then, said something to me in the car that I have never once forgotten. We were driving home from a family dinner where Diane had, once again, thanked the kids collectively for something I alone had organized down to the last detail. Ellie was quiet for several minutes, watching the streetlights pass, and then she said, without any real anger in her voice, just genuine 14-year-old confusion, "Why do you keep doing stuff for people who never say thank you?" I didn't have a good answer for her in that moment. I said something vague about family being complicated, about grown-up relationships not always working the way they're supposed to. But her question sat with me for weeks afterward, in a way that the exact same question from an adult never would have managed to. Year 9, continued 2024, the conversation with myself. Before I get to the discovery itself, I want to include one more moment from late that year, because it's the clearest evidence I have that some part of me already sensed what was coming before I had proof of it. In November, a few weeks before the first laptop notification, I sat down on my own without any prompting and wrote out, in the same notebook I'd been keeping for 6 years by then, a single question at the top of a blank page. What would I actually do if I found out they'd been managing me on purpose? I didn't answer it that night. I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. I think looking back, some quieter, more observant part of me had already been assembling the shape of the 11 emails long before I ever read a single word of them. Not the specific content, but the underlying architecture of it. The sense that 9 years of sideways asks and uneven credit had to be either an enormous, unbroken coincidence, or a pattern someone was actively, if only half-consciously, managing. I didn't want it to be the second thing. I wrote the question down anyway because some part of me needed to know I'd asked it honestly before I found out which answer was true. The discovery. The discovery came in January of this year, 4 months before the hospital waiting room I described at the very beginning of this story, and it did not come from snooping. I want to be entirely clear about that because it matters enormously for everything that happened afterward. I never once went looking for anything. It found me, entirely by accident, twice. Diane had asked me in December for help setting up online banking, since her local branch had closed permanently and the mobile app confused her badly. I sat with her at her own kitchen table, her laptop open between us, her reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair. While I was walking her carefully through setting up automatic bill pay, a notification popped up briefly on the screen from her email, visible for maybe 4 seconds before I instinctively clicked past it to keep working. It was a forwarded family group chat, one I already knew existed in some vague theoretical sense, but had never once seen the actual contents of, titled simply Mom Plus Kids. I didn't read anything that day. I want to be exact about that. I closed the laptop after finishing the bill pay setup and drove home and genuinely didn't think much more about it for almost 2 weeks, until Diane herself, without any awareness of what she was actually doing, forwarded me an entire email thread by mistake. It had been meant for Patricia, but landed in my inbox instead, because our names, Rachel and Patricia, sit directly next to each other alphabetically in her contacts app under the label Family, and her fingers, increasingly arthritic that winter, occasionally hit the wrong name entirely. The email chain was 11 messages long, stretching back nearly 4 months, and the subject line read in full, "Money stuff, don't loop Rachel in yet." I sat down at my own kitchen table that evening and read all 11 messages slowly in order, and I want to describe honestly what that actually felt like, because it wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no gasp, no dropped mug, no shouting. I read it the exact way I read a denied insurance claim at work, carefully, methodically, hunting for the precise language that actually mattered underneath the surrounding noise. The substance of it was this: Diane's finances were considerably worse than any of them had let on to me, worse than the roof gap 4 years earlier, worse even than the insurance confusion in 2019. She had accumulated nearly $34,000 in credit card debt over roughly 6 years, much of it tied to shortfalls the family itself had repeatedly created and never once repaid her for directly, including, I noted with a strange, still flat calm, more than $6,000 she had quietly, privately given Danny after his landscaping business failed in 2017, money that none of the rest of us had ever known she'd sent him on top of what we'd all already separately contributed. The family knew about the full picture. Patricia had known, according to the timestamps, for at least 8 months already. The plan, laid out plainly across those 11 messages, was this. They intended to bring me in specifically by name to help organize a fix, because, as Patricia phrased it in message 6, Rachel's good at this kind of stuff and she won't ask a lot of hard questions, she never really has. Message 9 from Colleen added, almost casually, just don't tell her the full number up front, ease her into it slowly, or she might actually push back this time. I read that last sentence 4 separate times. She might actually push back this time. Not if she might push back. This time meaning they understood on some level that every prior time had been a time I hadn't pushed back, that my long compliance wasn't the product of ignorance on my part, but of an established, observed, quietly relied upon pattern, one they had clocked collectively, and were now actively strategizing around, the way you plan around a known variable in a spreadsheet. I want to describe the 3 days that followed in a little more detail, because I think the space between discovering something and doing anything about it is where most of the real story actually happens, even though it's the part most people skip when they tell their own version of events later. On the first day, I went to work as normal, processed claims as normal, made small talk with Denise about a mutual coworker's retirement party, and told no one. I remember feeling almost proud of how normal I managed to seem, and then driving home that evening, feeling a small wave of something like disgust at myself for being proud of that particular skill. The skill of holding something enormous perfectly still inside myself, while performing normalcy for everyone around me. It occurred to me, sitting at a red light 2 blocks from my house, that I had apparently been training for this exact moment for 9 years without realizing it. On the second day, I reread all 11 emails again, this time printing them out at the small home office desk mark, and I shared, highlighting specific phrases in yellow, not for drama, but because that's genuinely how I process complicated documents at work, and I needed my brain to do the thing it already knew how to do with difficult material. I highlighted don't loop Rachel in yet. I highlighted she won't ask a lot of hard questions, she never really has. I highlighted ease her into it slowly. By the end of the second day, I had a printed, organized, 3-page summary that read less like a family conflict and more like a claims dispute. Which, I realized with a strange, distant clarity, was exactly the right lens to look at it through, because at its core it was a dispute over disclosure, over whether the people asking for money had an obligation to tell the person paying it the truth up front. I'd spent a decade enforcing that exact obligation on behalf of strangers at work. I had never once enforced it for myself. On the third day, I finally allowed myself to feel something other than procedural calm, and it came out sideways, the way suppressed things often do. I snapped at Mark over something small and unrelated, a dish left in the sink, and then immediately apologized. And then, standing in our kitchen with a wet dish towel still in my hand, I finally said the sentence out loud for the first time. I found something and I need to talk to you about it, but I'm not ready yet and I need you to trust that I will be. He didn't push. He said okay, and he did the dishes without being asked for the rest of that week, and I understood that small, quiet accommodation as its own kind of answer, even before either of us had said very much at all. I closed the laptop that first night, and I didn't tell Mark the full story until the third day had passed. I sat with what I'd read for those 3 full days, in the particular kind of stillness that settles over a person once they've finally understood that a decade of "we're so grateful to have you" had, underneath the surface the whole time, been a running ledger with my name written not in the column marked family, but in the column marked resource. Hash the decision. I didn't do anything rash, and I want to walk you carefully through the weeks that followed the discovery, because this section was, by a wide margin, the longest and hardest part of the entire experience, and I think it's the part that actually matters most. I want to be honest that there was a version of those 3 weeks where I considered simply saying nothing at all, ever, and continuing exactly as before. I want to include that because I think it's the honest, unglamorous truth underneath a lot of stories like this one, even the ones that end in a confrontation. Saying nothing would have been easier in the short term in almost every measurable way. It would have avoided the argument with Patricia, avoided the risk of permanently damaging my marriage, avoided the possibility that Diane might simply double down rather than apologize. I sat with that quieter, easier option seriously for at least a week, turning it over the same methodical way I turned over everything else. What ultimately moved me off of it wasn't outrage. It was something closer to exhaustion, the recognition that continuing to say nothing wasn't actually neutral. It was itself a continued yes, an ongoing, silent renewal of consent to a system I now knew, in writing, had been built partly around the assumption that I'd never look at it too closely. Staying silent, I realized, wasn't the safe option. It was simply the familiar one, and those aren't always the same thing, even when they feel identical from the inside. I also want to be honest about the ordinary days inside those 3 weeks, because they weren't all dramatic phone calls and therapy sessions. Most of them were just regular life, continuing on in parallel with the decision I was quietly making underneath it. I still went to work every day and processed claims and made small talk in the break room. I still made dinner most nights, still watched a show with Mark before bed, still texted Nora about unrelated things, a recipe, a movie, a coworker's ridiculous email. I think it's worth saying plainly that a person can be in the middle of the most consequential decision of their marriage and also, simultaneously, be doing laundry and answering emails and living an entirely unremarkable Tuesday. The two things don't cancel each other out. They just happen at the same time, quietly, the way most real turning points in a life actually do, not as a single cinematic moment, but as an accumulation of ordinary days that happen to be carrying something heavier underneath them than they let on. The first person I called was Priya, my closest friend from college, who had become a family law attorney almost by accident and had heard enough of my Doyle stories across 11 years to have developed strong opinions. She'd mostly kept diplomatically to herself out of respect for my marriage. I called her on a Thursday night, nearly a week after the discovery, and read her all 11 emails aloud, word for word, without editorializing. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped, and then she said something I wrote down afterward because I wanted to remember the exact phrasing. "Rachel, you've been functioning as this family's emergency fund with a pulse for 9 years running. And the only thing that's actually changed here is that now they've put the strategy in writing where you could eventually find it." I asked her directly what she thought I should do. She didn't tell me. Instead, she asked me a question that I later realized had been doing far more work than any direct advice ever could have. What are you actually afraid will happen specifically if you stop? Priya did eventually give me concrete, practical advice too, once I'd sat with that question for a while, and I want to include some of it, because it shaped the binder more than almost anything else. She told me that from a purely legal standpoint, none of what had happened constituted anything actionable. There was no fraud, no coercion in a legal sense, nothing a court would ever touch. And she wanted me to understand that clearly so I wasn't operating under any illusion that this was a legal problem wearing a family disguise. This isn't a case, Rachel, she said. It's a pattern, and patterns don't get fixed by proving someone did something wrong in a way a judge would recognize. They get fixed by making the pattern visible enough that continuing it becomes more uncomfortable than changing it. That single reframing visibility as the actual mechanism of change, rather than punishment or repayment, became the organizing principle behind everything I did afterward, from the binder itself to the quarterly check-ins we eventually built. She also told me something I initially resisted but came to agree with over time, that I needed to separate clearly in my own head two different goals I'd been quietly conflating: being repaid and being seen. You keep talking about the $23,000 like getting it back is the point, she said. I don't think it actually is for you. I think you'll do this whole confrontation and end up not asking for $1 of it back, and I think that's going to surprise you more than it surprises me. She was right. When it came down to the actual meeting, I never once asked for repayment of the $23,140. I only asked for it to be acknowledged in writing, as real. Priya had understood something about what I actually needed before I fully understood it myself. I didn't have a real answer for her that night. I sat with that single question for almost 2 full weeks afterward, turning it over the same way I turn over a denied insurance claim at work, hunting for the load-bearing assumption buried somewhere underneath it. Eventually I found it, and it wasn't complicated once I finally let myself see it. It was just genuinely hard to say out loud, even alone in my own kitchen. I was afraid that if I stopped being useful to the Doyles, I would find out definitively and all at once. That I had never actually belonged to that family at all, that 9 years of showing up, paying, organizing, fixing, absorbing had been the entire load-bearing foundation of my place in it. And that without that foundation, there would turn out to be nothing structural left holding me there at all. Diane's toast at our engagement dinner, "You still have time to think it over," had genuinely never fully stopped playing somewhere in the back of my mind across 11 years. Some part of me had spent the better part of a decade quietly trying to answer that toast, trying to make myself so indispensable, so consistently useful, that the underlying question of whether I truly belonged would simply become irrelevant, sidestepped rather than resolved. I talked to my younger sister, Nora, next, who had watched all of this unfold from a comfortable distance for years, and had rarely said more than a raised eyebrow at holidays, out of respect for the fact that it wasn't her marriage to comment on. When I finally told her about the 11 emails in full, she didn't say "I told you so," which I appreciated far more than I expected to in the moment. Instead, she said, "You've spent 9 years being this family's insurance policy, Rachel. Insurance policies don't get invited up for the toast. They just get called when something's on fire." That line sat with me for days, the way Priya's question had. Nora also said something else that night that I've thought about often since, something less quotable but maybe more useful. She reminded me of our own mother, who died when Nora and I were in our 20s, and how our mother used to say that the fastest way to find out what someone actually thinks of you is to become temporarily unable to do anything for them. "You've never actually run that test on the Doyles," Nora said. "Not once in 9 years. You've been so busy being useful that you never gave any of them the chance to show you what they'd do without that usefulness in the room." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It felt more like a diagnosis I'd been avoiding, the way you avoid a doctor's appointment for a symptom you're afraid has a bad name attached to it. I didn't run that test deliberately in the end. I don't think I could have brought myself to, even with everything I now knew. But I've come to believe the discovery itself ended up functioning as an accidental version of exactly what Nora described. For 3 months, while I was deciding what to do, I was quieter than usual at family gatherings, less immediately available, slower to volunteer for things I would have volunteered for instantly a year earlier. Nobody in the family seemed to register it as anything unusual at the time. It was only afterward, once the binder was on the table, that several of them separately told me they'd noticed something was different about me that spring and hadn't known how to ask what it was. I think that, too, was its own kind of answer, not a damning one exactly, but a telling one. 9 years of noticing what I did for them, and 3 months of not quite noticing what had changed in me. I talked to Denise, a coworker in patient advocacy at the hospital, who had a genuine gift for cutting cleanly through emotional fog using the same clinical clarity she brought to advocating for frightened, confused patients navigating impossible medical bills every single day. I laid out the numbers for her plainly. The roughly $23,000 I'd carefully tracked across 9 years, plus the newly discovered $34,000 in hidden debt hanging over Diane, plus the documented fact that they had explicitly planned to bring it to me without giving me the real, full number up front. Denise said without much hesitation, "In my line of work, when a patient's family tries to get us to sign off on something without giving us the complete picture, that's never an accident, Rachel. That's a deliberate strategy every single time. You'd flag that instantly if it was happening to some stranger's family. So flag it here too." And finally, 3 full weeks after first reading the emails, I talked to Mark on a quiet Sunday evening with the printed pages laid out flat on our kitchen table between us, because I am not, and have never once been, a person who explodes at anyone. I told him plainly what I'd found and what it meant. I watched something complicated move slowly across his face as I spoke, not shock exactly, more like the gradual, uncomfortable recognition of something he'd half known for a long time and had simply never let himself look at directly. He said quietly, almost pleadingly, "I swear I didn't know about the actual subject line on that thread. I didn't know it said that." I believed him. I still believe him today. But I also told him something I genuinely needed him to hear clearly without softening it. Knowing, and sort of not quite knowing on purpose, have gotten your family a very long way with me over the years, Mark. I need you to actually, finally decide this time which side of this you're standing on, not for the sake of one more toast, for the next 10 years of our marriage. He didn't answer me that particular night, and I let him have the space to sit with it because that felt fair to both of us. But I made a private decision of my own somewhere inside that waiting period, one I didn't share with him immediately. Whatever ultimately happened with Mark, whatever happened with the marriage itself, I was finished, completely and permanently, being handed a fix that had deliberately withheld the real numbers from me. If the Doyles genuinely wanted my continued help, going forward they were going to receive it exactly the way I gave help to every stranger in my professional life. With full documentation, full transparency, and my name recorded honestly in the column marked family, never again in the column marked resource. Or they weren't going to receive it at all from me, ever again. I also, in that same 3-week window, did something I hadn't planned on doing. I made a single appointment with a therapist, Dr. Alvarez, someone Denise had recommended months earlier for something entirely unrelated. I told her in that first session that I wasn't sure I even had a real problem to bring her, that it was just family stuff, nothing dramatic. She let that sit for a moment, and then she asked me to describe, in detail, the feeling in my body the moment I'd read message 9, the one about easing me into the number. I described it as flat, calm, almost businesslike. She asked if that was how I usually described feeling hurt. I said no, usually I feel hurt loudly, at least internally, even if I don't show it. She said gently, "Sometimes when something hurts too much to feel all at once, the body manages it by going very still and very procedural. That's not the absence of pain. That's often the shape pain takes when a person has had a great deal of practice not showing it." I didn't cry in that session. I cried in the parking lot afterward, sitting in my car for the second time in this story, except this time I didn't drive home and say nothing. I drove home and told Mark I wanted to talk. I want to include one more conversation from that window because it was the smallest one and in some ways the one that mattered most. I asked Ellie, then 14, if I could ask her something honestly, and she said sure, in the particular unbothered way teenagers agree to things. I asked her, "Do you think I'm actually part of this family, or do you think I just do a lot of stuff for it?" She thought about it for longer than I expected, which told me she was taking the question seriously rather than just reassuring me. Then she said, "I think you're the only one who acts like family is something you do, not just something you are by accident because you were born into it. Everyone else just sort of assumes it. You actually show up for it. I don't know why that would make you less family. If anything, it should make you more." I didn't tell her in that moment how much that answer would end up shaping the next 3 months. But it did, more than almost anything Priya, Nora, or Dr. Alvarez said to me across that entire period. That was the fear Priya had asked me to name back in that first phone call, finally fully answered. I had been afraid for years of discovering I didn't actually belong. And somewhere in the middle of those 3 long weeks, I finally realized that the answer no longer actually depended on whatever the Doyles ultimately decided to do. It depended entirely on what I decided I was still willing to accept in exchange for being called family. Hash has the confrontation. The hospital call came 6 weeks after that Sunday conversation with Mark, the same call I told you about at the very start of this story. Diane needed a procedure related, it turned out, to the fatigue she'd been quietly living with since 2019, the same year I'd fought her insurance gap down over 6 weeks of lunch break phone calls. I sat with her in that beige waiting room for 4 hours, held her stiff brown purse in my lap, filled out 4 separate intake forms, argued a pre-authorization code down over the phone, because, and I want to be completely honest about this, some decisions in life aren't actually about who deserves your help. They're about who you've decided to be, independent of what anyone around you deserves in the moment. I decided, sitting in that particular chair, that I was still going to be a person who shows up. What I hadn't fully decided yet, walking out of that hospital at 7 that evening, was what exactly I was willing to keep showing up as. I want to describe the 2 weeks between the hospital visit and the actual confrontation, because they weren't idle. I spent that time building something I hadn't originally set out to build. I pulled together 9 years of bank statements, Venmo records, cashed checks with memo lines, and the 11 forwarded emails. And I organized all of it the way I organize a complex claims file at work, chronologically, tabbed, cross-referenced, with a 1-page executive summary at the front, because that's the version of a hard truth that actually gets read all the way through. I didn't do this in anger, or at least it didn't feel like anger while I was doing it. It felt like the same calm, procedural instinct that had made me good at my job for over a decade. If you want someone to actually absorb a difficult truth, you don't hand them your feelings about it. You hand them a clean, dated, unimpeachable record, and you let the record do the emotional work you're too tired to keep doing yourself. I also spent part of those 2 weeks talking to Priya about what a fair, sustainable arrangement could actually look like going forward. Not a punishment, not a withdrawal of love, but a structure. She helped me draft, in plain language, a 1-page proposal. Any future financial help to Diane would be organized as a documented family plan, contributions calculated as a percentage of each sibling's actual income rather than a flat, even split. All numbers disclosed up front to everyone before any money moved. And this was the part I insisted on most firmly, an actual accounting of the roughly $23,000 I'd already contributed over 9 years, not for repayment necessarily, but simply for it to exist in writing, acknowledged, so that it could never again be quietly waved away as Rachel's fine with it. She's always been fine with it. I asked for the family meeting myself, which had genuinely never happened before in 9 years. Every prior kitchen table gathering had always been called by Diane, on her terms, in her house, at her convenience. This time I called Patricia directly and asked her to get everyone together the following Sunday. I could hear the surprise in her voice even through 3 words of agreement. The meeting happened at Diane's kitchen table, the same table where 9 years of family takes care of family decisions had been made without me ever once being asked what I actually thought, only informed, after the fact, what I would be expected to contribute. Patricia, Colleen, Danny, and Mark were all there. Diane sat at the head of the table like she always did, in the same chair she'd occupied for every single meeting I'd ever attended in that house. I brought the binder. Not dramatically, I set it down flat on the table the exact way I'd set down a claims file at work, unremarkable, the kind of object that doesn't need a raised voice behind it to make its point land. Inside, tabbed and dated, every dollar figure from 9 years, totaling $23,140 in documented family contributions, not counting time, mileage, or the smaller recurring things. Behind that, clean printed copies of all 11 emails, including the line about not telling me the full number and the line about me finally pushing back this time. Behind that, a straightforward summary of Diane's actual, full debt picture, the real $34,000, laid out exactly the way I would lay out any patient's full financial situation before recommending a plan, because that is genuinely what I do for a living, and it turns out I am good at it whether or not anyone in the room ever plans to thank me for it. I didn't raise my voice a single time, and I want you to understand that choice because it was the single most important decision I made in that entire room. Patricia got loud almost immediately. You went through Mom's email. You've been keeping some kind of secret file on all of us this whole time. And I let her finish completely without interrupting, and then I said calmly, evenly, I didn't go looking for anything, Patricia. Your mother forwarded it to me by accident, because our names sit next to each other in her contacts. And no, I haven't kept a secret file on anyone. I've kept the exact same kind of records I'd keep for any patient at work who asked for my help managing an impossible bill. The only thing I ever did differently for this particular family was never once asked to be paid for my time doing it. Colleen cried real tears, I believe, not performative ones, which was somehow harder to sit across from than open anger would have been. She kept saying through them, I never meant for you to actually see that message. I never meant it the way it sounds written down. And I told her gently but without backing down from the point, I understand that. I believe you didn't picture me reading it. But you wrote it, Colleen. It said what it said, whether or not you pictured me on the other end of it. Danny, to my genuine surprise, spoke up early and stayed quiet and steady the entire meeting, the way he'd been at that 4th of July barbecue 3 years earlier. He said plainly to the whole table, she's right. I knew about part of this too, and I didn't say anything because it was easier not to. That's on me as much as anyone. Patricia shot him a look. He didn't take it back. Diane, for her part, sat very still through most of it, the way I imagine I must have looked reading those 11 emails at my own kitchen table 3 months earlier. She didn't defend the plan itself, not once. Instead, when there was finally a pause, she said quietly, in a voice I'd genuinely never heard her use before, smaller than her usual voice, without any performance in it, we didn't want to lose you before we figured out how to actually ask you properly. Which was, I think, as close to real vulnerability as I ever received from Diane across 11 years. An admission that some part of her had known, all along, that asking me honestly, directly, with the full number attached, might cost her something she hadn't been willing to risk finding out. I told her honestly that I understood that particular fear better than she probably realized. I told her I had lived with a version of it myself for 9 years, the fear that if I ever stopped being useful, I would find out I had never really belonged in the first place. And then I said the line I had been turning over in my head, in one form or another, for close to 3 months, the line I would end up writing down afterward and never forget, because it was the only sentence in that entire 2-hour conversation that actually landed cleanly, all the way through, on everyone at that table at once. You don't get to find out whether someone's family by quietly testing how much they'll give up before they finally say no. That's not love, that's just an unpaid invoice with better manners. Nobody said anything for a long moment after that. The kitchen clock, an old analog one that had hung over Diane's stove for as long as I'd known her, ticked audibly for what felt like a full minute. Mark reached over under the table and put his hand over mine, quietly, without performance, the way he probably should have done at that engagement dinner 11 years earlier. I told the room I would still help. I wasn't walking away from Diane's actual medical and financial situation, because that isn't the kind of person I wanted to become, hurt or not, and I said so plainly. But I told them the terms were changing, permanently, starting that day. Any further financial help would move through a written plan, contributions calculated fairly against actual income rather than flat splits, with real numbers disclosed to everyone up front, every single time, with no exceptions from that meeting forward. No more sideways asks filtered through Mark, no more ease her into it slowly. If the family genuinely wanted my continued help, they were going to get it as family, honestly, transparently, acknowledged, or they weren't going to get it from me at all, ever again. Diane looked at the binder for a long moment, then looked up at me and asked quietly, can I actually read it? All of it, I mean, not just if you tell me what's in it. I slid it across the table to her. She put her reading glasses on and read the whole thing, cover to cover in silence, while 5 adults sat around her kitchen table and waited, and nobody said a single word until she finally closed it and set her hand flat on top of the cover. I owe you an apology. I don't think I know how to give properly, she said. I'm going to try anyway. I'm sorry, Rachel, not just for the money, for 9 years of acting like you were lucky to be useful to us. It wasn't a perfect apology. I don't think a perfect one exists for something that took 9 years to build. But it was a real one, and I told her I heard it, and that I appreciated it, and that it didn't erase anything, but it did matter. I want to describe one more exchange from that meeting before moving on, because it's the moment I keep returning to when I try to explain to people how the whole thing actually felt from the inside. After Diane's apology, there was a long silence, and then Patricia said, quietly, not defensively this time, I think I told myself for years that you were just naturally generous, because it was easier than admitting we were relying on that generosity instead of earning it. I didn't respond right away. I let it sit in the room, the way Dr. Alvarez had taught me to let things sit rather than rushing to fill silence with reassurance. Eventually, I said, I was generous. That part was true, but generosity isn't supposed to be the same thing as an assumption. You're allowed to notice the difference now. I'm just telling you I noticed it a long time before you did. Mark spoke last, and it was the only time in the entire meeting his voice shook slightly. He said to the table, not just to me, I've spent 9 years telling myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting my marriage. It wasn't. It was protecting my mother's comfort at the cost of my wife's. I'm sorry it took a binder for me to say that out loud instead of just knowing it. Diane reached over and put her hand on his arm, and for a moment I watched something pass between mother and son that had nothing to do with me at all. An old, complicated tenderness that I understood. In that instant, I would never fully be part of and didn't actually need to be part of, in order for my own place in that family to be real. The second meeting, building the actual plan. I want to tell you about the meeting that happened 2 weeks after the confrontation, because it matters as much as the confrontation itself, and it's the part most stories like this one skip entirely in favor of a clean emotional climax. We met again at Diane's kitchen table, this time with an actual spreadsheet, one I built with Priya's help, laying out Diane's real $34,000 in debt against her fixed income, a realistic month-by-month repayment schedule, and proposed contributions from each sibling calculated as a percentage of documented income rather than a flat, even split. Patricia's share came out higher than Danny's. Nobody argued about it because for the first time in 9 years, the math was visible to everyone in the room at the same time instead of negotiated privately, sideways, out of anyone else's sight. Patricia, to her credit in that specific moment if nowhere else, agreed to her number without the pushback I'd half expected. Colleen offered to take on a part-time second job for 8 months specifically to cover her share, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that spring. Danny's share was smaller, proportionate to his income, and he paid his first installment 3 days later, unprompted, before anyone had even followed up. My own contribution going forward was capped, in writing, at a fixed monthly amount tied to an actual repayment timeline with an end date on it, 18 months, not indefinite, not open-ended, not whatever comes up next. That single detail, the existence of an end date, mattered to me more than almost anything else in the entire plan. 9 years of open-ended asking had taught me that the absence of a stated endpoint was itself a kind of quiet exploitation, even when nobody involved would have called it that out loud. Diane, for her part, agreed to close 2 of her 3 credit cards and move the remaining balance to a single card with a lower interest rate that I helped her apply for, using the same knowledge I use every day at work. She also agreed, after some visible hesitation, to let Patricia, not me, deliberately not me this time, take over managing her monthly bill pay going forward, because part of the new arrangement was making sure the burden didn't simply collapse back onto the one person who'd always been willing to carry it silently. I also want to describe the drive over to that second meeting, because it was different from every other drive to Diane's house I'd made in 9 years. I remember noticing, at a stoplight 2 miles from her street, that my hands weren't gripping the steering wheel the way they usually did before a family gathering. That particular white-knuckle readiness I'd apparently carried, unconsciously, into that house for the better part of a decade, bracing for whatever sideways ask might be waiting on the other side of the door. This time I knew exactly what was waiting. A spreadsheet, a fair process, a conversation where I had already been told, plainly, what would be discussed and why. I hadn't realized how much of my previous dread had come specifically from not knowing, from the sideways nature of every request, until I felt the absence of that dread driving over with an actual agenda in the passenger seat next to me. I want to describe one small, specific moment from that second meeting, because it stayed with me more clearly than almost anything from the confrontation itself. About an hour in, going line by line through the spreadsheet, Diane stopped, took off her reading glasses, and said, to no one in particular, I don't think I've ever actually seen the whole picture of my own money laid out like this before. Not once, not even when Frank was alive. He handled all of it, and then suddenly I was handling all of it, and I don't think I ever really learned how. I just sort of muddled through and hoped. It wasn't an excuse. She said it plainly, almost matter-of-factly, the way you'd report a fact about the weather. But it reframed something for me, sitting at that table. Some of what I had spent 9 years reading as manipulation had genuinely been manipulation, deliberate and at times coordinated among the siblings. But some of it underneath that had also just been an elderly widow's decades-long avoidance of a number she found too frightening to look at directly, patched over year after year, by whichever child happened to be most willing to look at it for her. Both things were true at once. I didn't have to choose between being angry at the machinery of it and feeling something like compassion for the fear underneath it. I got to hold both, and honestly, holding both turned out to be more sustainable long-term than holding either one alone. We also used that second meeting to set up something that hadn't existed in 9 years. A standing family financial check-in, scheduled quarterly with all 5 adult children present, where any upcoming need, medical, structural, otherwise, would be disclosed to the whole group at once, with real numbers before any individual sibling was approached privately. Patricia offered to keep the shared document updated, which surprised me, and which she has, to her credit, actually maintained consistently in the time since. It wasn't a dramatic fix. It was a boring, procedural, unglamorous fix, the kind that rarely makes it into the emotional climax of a story like this one. But boring and procedural, I've come to believe, is usually what actually prevents the next 9 years from looking exactly like the last 9. Aftermath. I won't pretend the months that followed were a clean, total resolution, because they genuinely weren't, and I promised myself early on that I wouldn't hand you a version of this story with a bow tied neatly around it. Real families don't resolve that cleanly, even the ones that get better. 1 month later, Diane and I talked on the phone twice that first month, briefly, mostly logistics related to her recovery and the repayment plan. There was a formality to those calls that hadn't existed before, a careful politeness on both sides that felt, honestly, a little bit like grief for the version of the relationship we'd both been pretending was fine for 9 years, even though it hadn't fully deserved that grief in the first place. I noticed I didn't mind the formality as much as I expected to. It felt oddly more honest than the warmth that had come before it. 3 months later, Patricia and I remained, and still remain today, more distant than we'd been before the discovery, not hostile, just quieter, more careful with each other. She never offered a direct apology. What I got instead was a version that included the word "if," the kind that manages to acknowledge the discomfort without ever quite claiming responsibility for causing it. We're cordial now at family gatherings, nothing more, nothing less, and I've genuinely made peace with that being the ceiling of what that particular relationship is going to become. Not every relationship in a story like this one gets repaired, and I think it's important to say that plainly instead of pretending otherwise for the sake of a tidier ending. I want to add a detail about my own job, oddly enough, because it changed too in a small way over that same year, and I think it's worth including. A few months after the confrontation, I found myself handling a case at work involving an elderly patient whose adult children had been quietly steering her toward a payment plan that benefited them more than her, using almost exactly the same sideways request architecture I'd just spent 9 years living inside of. I recognized it instantly, in a way I don't think I would have a year earlier, and I flagged it to my supervisor with more confidence and more specific language than I'd ever used in a similar situation before. My supervisor asked afterward what had made me catch it so quickly this time. I told her honestly, I've gotten very good recently at recognizing when someone's being asked something sideways instead of directly. She didn't ask what I meant by that, and I didn't explain. But I noticed, walking back to my desk, that the thing which had cost me 9 years inside my own family had also made me measurably better at protecting strangers inside my job, and I wasn't sure yet whether that trade felt fair. I still don't know if I've fully decided. Colleen, to my real and lasting surprise, reached out entirely on her own about 6 weeks after the confrontation and asked if we could get coffee, just the two of us, no agenda attached. She apologized again, more fully this time, without the softening "if" that Patricia's version had leaned on. She told me she'd been the one who actually typed the line about not telling me the full number, and that seeing her own words printed out in that binder, in black and white, dated and time-stamped, had been the first moment she genuinely had to look at what she'd written instead of simply having half-thought it in passing and moved on. We're not close in the way Ellie and I are close, but we've built something real and steady since that coffee, slowly, for the first time in the 9 years I'd known her. Danny sent me a handwritten card a few weeks after the second meeting. It read simply, "You were right to say something, and I should have said something myself a long time before you had to. Thank you for looking out for Mom even when we didn't really deserve it from you. I keep that card in the same kitchen drawer where I used to keep the notebook." I want to say a little more about Danny, actually, because his arc through this story is the one that surprised me most. He'd been, for most of the 9 years I'd known him, the family member I understood least, pleasant, likable, but somehow always slightly outside the family's central drama, neither favored like Patricia nor scrutinized like Colleen occasionally was. After the confrontation, he told me privately, over coffee a few weeks later, that he'd actually noticed the pattern years before I ever brought a binder to that kitchen table, but had told himself it wasn't his place to say anything, since he himself had been the problem child with the landscaping money, and didn't feel he had standing to point at anyone else's dynamics. "I figured if I said something, everyone would just say, 'Look who's talking,'" he told me. "So I stayed quiet, and staying quiet felt safer, even though I knew it wasn't right." I told him I understood that logic better than he probably expected me to, that staying quiet had been my entire operating strategy for 9 years too, just dressed up in more competent packaging. We've become genuinely close since that conversation, in a way I don't think either of us anticipated. He's the one who now organizes the quarterly family financial check-ins on the shared calendar, a small, deliberate act of taking on a piece of the invisible labor that used to fall only to me. 6 months later, Mark and I are honestly in a better place than we've been in years, not because the underlying tension disappeared, but because we finally actually talked about it directly, out loud, more than once, instead of managing around it quietly the way we had for 9 years. He started attending Diane's financial planning conversations himself, actively, instead of forwarding requests to me to just sort out. That shift alone changed more about our marriage than almost anything else in this entire story. I noticed, somewhere around month 5, that I'd stopped bracing every time his phone rang on a Sunday afternoon. 1 year later, Diane finished repaying her full $34,000 balance, 6 weeks ahead of the 18-month schedule we'd built together, thanks in large part to Colleen's second job and Patricia's higher, income proportional contributions actually holding steady the entire way through. At the small dinner the family held to market Diane's idea, not mine, she stood up with a glass of wine, the same way she had at her 65th birthday party 9 years earlier, and thanked, specifically and by name, all 5 of us: Patricia, Colleen, Danny, Mark, and me. My name, out loud at the table for the first time in 9 years of dinners. It wasn't a large gesture in the scheme of things. It was one sentence. But I noticed it landed in my chest the way small, overdue things sometimes do, quietly and more completely than a grand one ever could have. And Ellie, 15 now, remains the clearest redemptive thread in this whole story, the one I promised you at the very start. A few months after the original confrontation, at a much smaller, much quieter family dinner, I watched her stand up on her own, entirely unprompted, and thank me specifically, by name in front of the whole table, for driving her to a debate tournament the week before, the exact kind of small, ordinary thing none of the adults in that family had ever quite managed to name out loud for me across 9 full years. Diane, sitting right beside her, went very still for a moment and then said quietly, "You're right, Ellie, thank you, Rachel." It wasn't a grand gesture either. It was one more sentence 9 years overdue, echoing the first one. But I noticed that Ellie had learned, without anyone directly teaching her, the exact thing it took me 9 years and a binder to finally insist on for myself: that the people who show up deserve to be named out loud in the room, in real time, not just quietly relied upon and thanked later, if ever, in passing. 2 years later, I want to close this part of the story honestly, without pretending the last 2 years turned into some seamless, uncomplicated version of family life, because they didn't, and I think stories like this one lose something important when they pretend otherwise. Patricia and I are still cordial rather than close, and I've stopped waiting for that to change into something warmer. There is a version of this story where I tell you time healed that particular distance completely. It didn't, not fully, and I've made a genuine peace with that being the honest ending for that one relationship rather than forcing a reconciliation neither of us actually feels. But other things did shift meaningfully over those 2 years. Diane and I now talk on the phone most weeks, not out of obligation, but because she started asking me things she never used to ask about my job, about a difficult claims case I was working through, about whether Mark and I were doing all right. The kind of small, ordinary questions that add up over time into something that finally resembles being known rather than simply being useful. Last spring, at a family barbecue, I watched her introduce me to a new neighbor not as Mark's wife, the way she had for 9 straight years, but as my daughter-in-law Rachel, who's brilliant with anything financial and has bylaid this whole family out more times than any of us deserve. It wasn't a perfect introduction. It still framed me partly through usefulness, but it was said with real warmth in public, unprompted, and I noticed I no longer needed it to be perfect in order for it to matter. Colleen and I have become genuinely close, closer than I ever expected given how the whole thing started. She calls me now sometimes just to talk about nothing in particular, the way you call an actual friend rather than a resource. She told me last winter, half joking but not entirely, that reading her own name attached to that email in my binder was the most effective wake-up call anyone's ever given me. And I say that as someone who's been to therapy about 3 separate things since. I want to be honest about one more thing before I close this out. I still help this family. I still show up. I was at Diane's follow-up appointment 3 months ago, sitting in a different, slightly less beige waiting room holding the same stiff brown purse. But I noticed something different this time, something that mattered more to me than I expected it to. Before I left the house that morning, Mark asked me directly, "Do you want me to come too, or do you want to do this one on your own?" It was a small question. It was also the first time in 11 years anyone in that family had asked me what I wanted, rather than simply assuming what I'd do. I said I wanted him to come. He came. We sat together in that waiting room, and for the first time in this entire story, I wasn't the only one holding the purse. I noticed sitting there beside him that the room itself looked almost exactly like the first one. The same tired beige walls, the same silent renovation show playing somewhere overhead, the same decaf-only coffee machine offering its small, absurd cruelty to everyone waiting. Nothing about the room had changed at all. What had changed was that I wasn't cataloging its details alone this time, filing them away in the same private, procedural part of myself I'd been running on for 9 straight years. Mark noticed the coffee machine too, out loud, and made a small joke about it. And I laughed, actually laughed, in a hospital waiting room for what I think was the first time in this entire story. It wasn't a large moment, but I've come to believe that most of the moments that actually rebuild something aren't large. They're small, ordinary, and shared, which is, I think, the whole difference between the 9 years before that binder and everything that's come after it. What I actually learned. Before I get to the line I promised you at the start, I want to spend a moment on something I don't think I fully understood until I sat down to put this whole story into words for you. For 9 years, I operated under a quiet, unexamined belief that belonging had to be earned continuously, reproven at every family dinner, every emergency, every quiet request passed sideways through Mark instead of asked to me directly. I thought that was simply what it meant to marry into a family rather than be born into one, that outsiders pay an ongoing toll that insiders don't, and that complaining about the toll was itself a kind of proof you didn't deserve to be let past it. I don't think that belief was entirely irrational, given what I'd actually witnessed in that family's early treatment of me. But I've come to think it was incomplete, and dangerously so, because it left me with no internal mechanism for recognizing when reasonable toll paying had curdled into something closer to quiet exploitation, dressed up in the vocabulary of family loyalty. The thing that finally broke the pattern wasn't anger in the end, though anger was certainly present somewhere underneath the calm. It was documentation. It was the simple, almost boring act of writing things down, dating them, keeping the receipts, treating my own family the way I'd treat a claims file at work, not because I loved them less by doing so, but because I finally extended to myself the same basic standard of fairness I extended to total strangers every single day at my job. I would never, not once in 11 years, have allowed a patient's family to quietly withhold the real cost of a procedure from the person being asked to pay it. It took me 9 years to apply that same standard to my own kitchen table. I also learned, more slowly and more painfully, that Diane's fear and my fear were, underneath everything, mirror images of each other. She was afraid that asking me honestly, with the real numbers attached, might cost her my help entirely. I was afraid that refusing to help without the real numbers might cost me my place in the family entirely. Both fears were, in their own way, about the same underlying question: whether love in that family had ever actually been separable from usefulness. For any of us, including Diane herself, who had spent over 20 years believing her own worth was tied to how completely she could hold everyone together without ever admitting she was struggling to do it. I don't think I've fully resolved that question, even now, even a year out from the confrontation. But I've stopped needing it fully resolved in order to keep showing up. That, I think, might be the actual difference between what I was doing for 9 years and what I do now. Before, I showed up to prove I belonged. Now I show up because I've decided I belong, and the showing up is simply what I choose to do with that belonging, not the price I pay to keep earning it. I also think, looking back across the whole 9 years at once now instead of one chapter at a time, that the binder itself was never really the point, even though it's the object everyone in the family remembers most vividly from that day. The binder was just paper. What actually mattered was the decision underneath it. The decision that I was allowed to ask for the truth plainly before agreeing to carry a burden, and that asking for it wasn't a betrayal of love, whatever 9 years of quiet sideways requests had trained me to believe. I think a lot of people watching this recognize some version of that same trained belief in their own lives, in families that look nothing like the Doyles on the surface, but run on the exact same underlying machinery. If that's you, I hope this story gave you permission you didn't know you were waiting for. Thesis line callback. I think about that kitchen table often now, and about the line I said to Diane that day, because I've come to believe it's true of more relationships than just my own. You don't get to find out whether someone's family by testing how much they'll give up before they finally say no. That's not love. That's just an unpaid invoice with better manners. Family, I've learned across these 9 years, was never actually supposed to be measured by how much someone will silently absorb without complaint. It was always supposed to be measured by whether they'd still be asked honestly, still be thanked out loud, still be named at the table, even in the years when they had nothing left to give. I say the line differently to myself now than I said it at that kitchen table, quieter, more like a private compass than a public confrontation. When Mark's phone rings on a Sunday afternoon, I no longer brace automatically. I just wait to hear whether the ask, if there is one, comes to me directly or comes sideways. That single distinction, more than any dollar figure I ever tracked, has become the actual measure I use now for whether a request is love or something dressed up to resemble it. Outro. 9 years is a long time to spend learning a single lesson, but I don't think I'd trade the version of myself who finally walked into that kitchen with a binder for the version who kept quietly writing checks and calling it love. I like this version of myself better. I think Ellie does too. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever been the reliable one, the useful one, the person who gets the emergency phone call but never quite gets the invitation, I hope it left you with something worth carrying. Your patience was never actually supposed to be the price of admission into your own family, and it is genuinely never too late to ask for the real number before you say yes again. I think about Ellie sometimes, at 15, standing up at that quiet dinner table and thanking me by name without anyone teaching her to. I think about the fact that whatever changes in this family from here forward, she's already absorbed the actual lesson before any of the adults around her fully articulated it. That showing up and being named for it aren't supposed to be two separate, negotiable things. If there's a next generation of this family that does it better than mine did, I suspect it starts with her, in ways none of us will get full credit for and none of us particularly need to. If this one resonated with you, share it with someone who'd understand it without needing it explained. Tell me in the comments which specific moment hit closest to home for you, and subscribe if you'd like more stories like Rachel's. Thank you sincerely for spending this much time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.